Okay, so good morning, everybody. Welcome to our new webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to kick off our latest webinar where we will explore one of the most fascinating evolutionary laboratory on Earth, that is the Galapagos Islands, where I'm at currently. It's an honor also to introduce our guest speaker, William Durham. He's a biological anthropologist and evolutionary biologist and Bing Professor Emeritus in Human Biology at Stanford University. So his work has helped shape how we understand evolution, human-environment interactions, and also the Galapagos. So please join us and welcome Professor Durham as we begin today's journey through evolution, adaptation, and sometimes the surprising limits of speciation as well.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Camila, and thanks to everyone and all my friends at CDF for putting this together. I'm just going to take a moment here to share my screen and we'll be underway. Well, it says sharing is not turned on, so I need to request sharing for the webinar.
Yes, please.
Still having trouble with that issue. It's nice to have you all here this morning. I look forward to talking with you and taking your questions at the end. Let's see if we can share now. No, still not.
Okay. Could you do it right now? I think so.
There we go.
There we go.
Very good. Okay, I use this one just to get a sense of the dimensions. So good morning, everyone. The lava lizard, the marine iguana, and I wish you a very happy World Biodiversity Day today, celebrating the full variability of life on Earth, its biological and cultural variability, commemorating the adoption of the UN Convention on Biodiversity at Rio de Janeiro on this date, May the 22nd, back in 1992. Alas, it's still not ratified by the United States of America, South Sudan, and Andorra. Maybe we can do something about that in the years ahead. The biodiversity of Galapagos is, of course, renowned, but not for the breadth of its diversity, but for its uniqueness. Consider the 3 species of boobies, for example. The 3 species of boobies I like to think of as the red, the white, and the blue, but only the red and blue refer to their feet. The white refers to its plumage, the Nazca booby in the middle. So we have the red-footed booby on the left, the Nazca booby in the middle, and the blue-footed booby on the right. Where else in the world would you see marine iguanas, for example, other than in Galapagos? This is the Española subspecies that has some very beautiful colors. Of course, they feed on seaweed using their very amazing teeth, right, sharp in the front there, and pull back that seaweed, and that's how they subsist, the marine iguanas. With stomachs full of marine algae, you often see them warming up in the sun and snorting salt. Of course, we also have land iguanas in Galapagos, including the pallid one, C, and including the pink iguana, a recent finding that's shown here at the top in a picture from Tweederoy. We have an albatross in Galapagos nesting on the equator. Can you imagine? Waved albatross. I'm going to have to get rid of this bar that's blocking my view here. I'm sorry to bother you with that. There we go. The waved albatross is the world's only albatross species to roost within 20 degrees latitude north or south of the equator. How does it manage to do that? We really have to consider the difficulties of an albatross. That's basically a hang glider with an animal hang glider. We have to figure out how it can do that in the absence of the strong winds that it has at the furious 40s and the roaring 50s. And it's the only albatross in the world to build no nest. How interesting is that? For example, the black-browed albatross of the Falkland Islands has a beautiful cup-shaped nest. Galapagos is home of the world's only nocturnal gull, the swallowtail gull, with these big bulging eyes, showing that it's indeed nocturnal. Its chicks start out small, but remind me of my own teenage children as they grow up and become even bigger than the adults sometimes. We have a species of penguin on the equator in Galapagos. Imagine that, the world's only species of penguin north of the equator. Of course, they're Antarctic birds, and here we have one on the equator. Imagine that. We have flamingos too in Galapagos, a Caribbean bird, of course, but hang on, wait a second. Flamingos and penguins in the same little place? There are island clusters in Galapagos where you can see both of these within a matter of a few kilometers. And all over the world, cormorants are graceful flyers. This is a neotropical cormorant in the Amazon, but not here in Galapagos. The Galapagos cormorant is flightless. Look at those amazing piddly wings and that very large body. The islands are also chock full of beautifully peculiar plants, like Darwin's cotton on the left, like the unusual passion flower with bat-shaped leaves, like the endemic lantana, not to be confused with the introduced lantana. The endemics are all white. The islands are chock full of these beautiful endemic plants, but to me, the most amazing of all of them are these. This is a fabulous plant. It's the daisy tree of Galapagos. Scalesia pedunculata is its botanical name. A daisy tree, you're saying? You've got to be kidding. Bill, what did you have for breakfast? But it is a tree. It grows in a forest. Here's to give you a sense of a forest of daisy trees in Galapagos. And here is a billboard along the Baltra Highway to give you a sense of scale. Way up in the canopy, you'll find small composite flower heads that are a giveaway that it belongs to the Asteraceae, the composite flowers that look very much like a starburst or a daisy. And you can see that these are, in fact, daisies with, so to speak, the petals removed. In this canopy lives another iconic species. In the canopy of this unique giant daisy, there lives another iconic species, the tool-using woodpecker finch, shown here holding a spiny branch of cat's claw, which it inserts like a plumber's aid. You may have used a plumber's aid to clean a clogged sink. It inserts it with the spines pointing back toward the bird, which means that, in fact, as it goes in, you can just make out the targeted grub that it's after right there just at the corner of the picture, and it will pull out anything edible along the way as it removes that wonderful spiny branch. Well, the young Charles Darwin, who initially made the Galapagos famous at age 26 on his visit there, he did not see all the unique biodiversity of the place, but he saw enough biodiversity. He didn't see the flightless cormorant, he didn't see the penguin. There are many things he didn't see, but he saw enough to say that he was astonished at the amount of creative force, if such an expression may be used, displayed on these small, barren, and rocky islands. Now, notice this is in 1839, 20 years before he was to release On the Origin of Species. Secretly, he'd been working away on evolutionary thinking by 1839, and so he's just giving you a little glimpse of what's to come, the creative force, if such an expression may be used, on these small, barren, and rocky islands. So why is Galapagos so good at making new species? That's my title for today, and sometimes not good at making new species. Here's my email address. I hope you'll write to me if you have follow-up questions that we don't have time to cover everyone's questions. But I want to emphasize at the start that Galapagos does not exactly make new species, as my title would imply. Evolution makes the new species, of course, and does so readily in the Galapagos Islands. Why is that? Why is Galapagos especially conducive to the formation of new species by evolutionary processes? And how did the youthful Darwin happen to notice the astonishing amount of creative force in Galapagos? Let's start with the second question first and come back to what makes Galapagos conducive. As you know, most of the Beagle voyage, Darwin set forth on the HMS Beagle at the invitation of Captain Fitzroy after some hemming and hawing about the shape of Darwin's nose and so on, and some hemming and hawing by Darwin's father. By 1831, it was underway. And the first 2.5 years of the Beagle voyage were spent on the east coast of South America. Now, the whole trip was supposed to take 3 years initially. Fitzroy was so compulsive and took all these chronometers to measure the bays and the latitudes and so on for the Royal Navy that he went back and forth and back and forth, and you can see the roundabout course they went. You can see they came out here to the Falklands or Malvinas Islands. You can see that it was another 1.2 years on the West Coast when Darwin did some hiking up into the Andes and so on. When they finally arrived in Galapagos, 3.7 years in, they didn't return for 5 years, as you can tell from 1836. When they got to the Falklands, it's worth pausing to look at what happened in the Falklands, because Darwin's going to refer to it in a minute. There's the East Falkland Island, the West Falkland Island, and there the crew brought Darwin two different fox morphs, that is to say, two different morphologies of the same wolf-like fox. Now, it's now considered a wolf, but they talked about it as the wolf-like fox at that time, one from the East and one from the West Falkland Island. It was also called the friendly wolf, so tame that it ran up to the hunters of the beagle and to every other ship. This was actually an anomalous friendly vertebrate that would just run up to the hunters who were out to kill it. Said Darwin, out of the 4 specimens of the foxes on board, the three are darker and come from the east. There's a smaller and rusty-colored one, which comes from the West Island. A whaling captain says that all from this island are smaller and of this shade of color. So here's one of the 2 shades. Not only is this species different from any of the other species of fox on the mainland of South America, but appears to be somewhat different on each of the 2 main islands. Here's the Patagonian fox, and you can see that it's clearly different from the Patagonian fox, which is the closest living fox on the other side of the separation of the water that separates the Malvinas or Falklands from South America. So here we have a lovely enigma. There are 2 4-footed mammals in the Falklands, and they're different from one another across this small separation of 2 little islands. And they're also very different from their mainland counterparts. Noted Darwin, there is no other instance in the world, he thought, of so small a mass of broken land, distant from a continent, we know 460 kilometers roughly, possessing so large a quadruped peculiar to itself. And indeed it exists there in 2 forms. Well, the Beagle sailed on and eventually, in September of 1835, reached the Galapagos Islands. And the Beagle arrived first at Chatham Island, what it was called then, now called San Cristobal. And Darwin was immediately taken and impressed by the mockingbirds. He had just spent 1.2 years along the western coast of South America, of the mainland, where he found time and time again this Chilean mockingbird, Mimus thinca. Mimus thinca, Darwin wrote, is inquisitive, active, very fast, and they sing tolerably well, he noted in his notes. Well, he arrives with the image of the Mimus thinca in his mind from his last year, almost year plus. The young Darwin arrives out in Chatham Island of Galapagos, and the first thing he sees, among the first things he sees, is what we call the Chatham mockingbird. Well, if you look closely, you can see they both have a stripe through the eye. They both have 2 stripes on the wing. There's an overall similarity in structure, shape, and plumage coloration of these birds. Darwin pulls out his pocket notebook, which we have copies of to this day, and I'm going to show it to you. He uses the word thinca to refer to mockingbird, and he also crosses out the text as he recopied his pocket notebook into other notebooks that were intended to be more permanent. Happily, we have the pocket notebook in which he wrote this on the spot, we think. The thinca are very tame and curious in these islands. I certainly recognize South America in ornithology. Would a botanist? Wow, fabulous for a 26-year-old to be arriving in an island and recognize, quote, South America in ornithology. Would a botanist? So he's wondering, would this generalize to the botanical realm? Because he's wandering around amidst lots of shrubby plants as well. What's interesting is that on Chatham Island, the mockingbirds were relatively abundant, and they were very, very familiar looking to the thinca of South America. The same was true when Darwin visited 3 other Galapagos Islands, as you can see here in this Landsat composite image, but it got even better. As he moved on from San Cristobal, which was then called Chatham, to Charles, which today we call Floriana, and moved from there to Albemarle, which today we call Isabella, and from there to James, which we call Santiago, he picked up other specimens of the mockingbird. And he was soon to note that, yes, the Chatham mockingbird reminded him of the mainland mockingbird, but so did the Charles mockingbird from the island we call today Floriana. Look at it. It's a very similar stripe through the eye, very similar beak. It has some spots on the chest, and it has 3 bands on the wings instead of the 2 from the mainland or the 2 from the Chatham. That's interesting. 3 bands. It's 3-banded, trifasciatus. They sailed on to Albemarle and from there to James, and as Darwin left behind the Charles mockingbird, he found the Albemarle or Isabella Island mockingbird. Whoa, back to the 2 stripes on the wings and a very clear chest, but still a stripe through the eye. And on he went to Santiago, James or Santiago Island, very similar to the Albemarle. In fact, he concluded rightly that these 2 were the same morphology. So what do we have then? In short, Darwin had 4 specimens from 4 islands, and they were all different from the mainland species, and 3 were different from each other, starting with the Chatham mockingbird on the first island he landed. He collected these 3 morphs. Here's from the display at the California Academy of Sciences. Conveniently, you can see all 3 for yourself if ever you visit the Cal Academy. Delightful place to visit. And one can readily see the differences in the specimens on display. What did Darwin make of this? Fortunately, Darwin loved to keep notebooks. He was a very deliberate and persistent note taker, and so he tells us. He found the differences between islands and the mockingbirds to be an object of fascination, and after leaving the Galapagos, he wrote in his ornithological notebook, recopying notes from his hip pocket field notebook. He said, when I see these islands, this is in the ornithological notebook, in sight of each other and possessed of but a scanty stock of animals, tenanted by these birds, but slightly differing in structure from one island to another, and filling the same place in nature, eating similar food, similar behavior, I must suspect they are only varieties. The only fact of a similar kind of which I'm aware is the constant asserted difference between the wolf-like fox of East and West Falkland Islands, which we just looked at, and he told us that they were consistently different and that the whaling captain asserted the same. If there is the slightest foundation for these remarks, the zoology of archipelagos will be well worth examining, says Darwin, for such facts undermine the stability of species. Oh, he has a second thought and goes back with a caret and inserts the word would. This he wrote in 1836 as they were sailing back to England from their visit in 1835, in September, October of 35. He wrote this in 1836, we know from the careful sleuthing of my colleague Frank Soloway. Here are Darwin's original notes in his notebook, and I just want to show you the caret I mentioned. For such facts undermine the stability of species, but then he says, no, it would, because he could not be sure. On second thought, he added the word would because he could not be sure that they were in fact species. Well, why would these simple mockingbirds undermine the stability of species? This big topic, long assumed to be the case in philosophical, scientific, and religious thought. Of course, we'll never know exactly what Darwin was thinking, but consider the, quote, mockingbird world, the overall landscape of mockingbirds that Darwin had experienced for his previous 3 years in South America. Mockingbirds there were single species over large areas. The Finca, for example, right, covered most of Chile, and he found them several places up and down the coast. Similarly, in Brazil, the same mockingbird covers an enormous area of Brazil. Darwin arrives, he sails into a different world, where it's a world of tiny ranges of 1 species per island for the first 3 islands that you encounter in Galapagos. Now, he only went to 2 of them, But the San Cristobal or Chatham mockingbird is different from the Floriana or Charles mockingbird. We know today that the Española mockingbird is also different. And then Darwin did pick up a third species, the Galapagos mockingbird, which we know characterizes the other islands in this yellow circle. So what's fascinating then is that the mockingbirds really got Darwin thinking. They had such a different distribution in Galapagos. They replaced each other in space from island to island. He noticed the location and habits of each. He saw that they were morphologically different, even occupying the same place in nature, as he put it. He inferred that they replace each other on different islands, that there's only one morph found on each of the islands he visited, never two morphs that he found. And we know they were important to his thinking, that this simple observation of mockingbirds, in the midst of this long voyage of the Beagle with many observations and many different species collected, we know they were important because it made him go back and look at those other species. Look at the list he made just after the Galapagos. He compiled lists of candidate replacements in the way that the mockingbirds replaced one another. Their morphologies replaced one another across the islands. He wants to go back now and see what else replaced what else. So he said the guanaco replaced the vicuña. He said the tucutuco replaced another one of species in Chile. The Falkland fox replaces the mainland fox, and so on. This is simply a list of replacements asking, wow, is this a more general phenomenon in the biotic world than simply from island to island in Galapagos? But Darwin, a cautious fellow, sort of kept wondering, but all of this is not a big deal if they're only varieties. Were they distinct species on the different islands? In his notebook, he considered that possibility. And then he said, no, they must only be varieties, different varieties. The Beagle returned to England in 1836, and Darwin very wisely sought the help of experts. He turned to Joseph Hooker at Kew Garden for help on plants. He turned to John Gould, perhaps the world's leading ornithologist of all, for help on birds. He asked Richard Owen to work on the fossil mammals, which led Richard Owen to very different conclusions than Darwin, and they became sort of arch enemies, but that's beside our point today. Gould looked at Darwin's mockingbirds and gave them a thorough going over. These are actually from the Tring collection, the British Museum at Tring, and you can see it says collected by Charles Darwin on the name tags. In February, Gould confirmed to Darwin in person that the mockingbirds represent 3 new species, and he gave them species names and he painted their picture, as you see here, from Darwin's taxidermied specimens. He caught the 3-banded Nesomimus trifasciatus. Well, he had a different generic name at that time, but he insisted they were not just varieties, and the sort of bewildered Darwin had convinced himself that these had to be varieties or else so much would be up in question because they replace each other island to island in the islands he visited in Galapagos. They were not just varieties, so Darwin wanted to be convinced. How sure was Gould? He convinced Darwin that if birds as so different as Trifasciatus, the one with the 3 stripes, and Parvulus, the regular Galapagos mockingbird, can be considered as varieties of one species, then the experience of all the best ornithologists, implicating himself, must be given up. In other words, all of ornithology says that these must be different species. Darwin said, wow, that's good enough for me. If John Gould says these are different species or ornithology as we know it must be given up, I've got some thinking to do. And within a month of meeting with Gould in his Notebook B, you've heard and read about in March of 1837, just a month after his meeting where Gould says, these are different species, Charles. These mockingbirds are different species. He started, I think, and then paused, one species modified for different ends. Thus, genera would be formed bearing relation. In other words, from a single ancestor being modified for different ends, you could generate multiple species fitting different places in nature, perhaps. And that's how you would form genera, different genus relationships, all showing some similarity. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing for a 27, 28-year-old to be working all of this out? This we consider today to be the first tree of life diagram in the Darwinian tradition. There were other trees of life before Darwin, but this is the first to capture that branching tree, that idea that you get modification for different ends in branches that are isolated from one another, allowing the differences to accumulate until they become different species within a genera, showing relationships among the species because of their descent relation, because they are derived by descent from a common ancestor. What a powerful metaphor is this little tree of life. It's also fascinating, at least to me. Darwin was fascinated by Spanish, but didn't speak a whole lot. He did tend to warn himself a bit in Spanish. And so in that same notebook B, 7 pages later, still in 1837, he wrote, "Heaven knows whether this agrees with nature. Cuidado." It's like, young man, be careful. This may just be your imagination. This may not be the reality of the world. Be careful because of the importance of this finding. To summarize, then, the diversity of mockingbirds in this little archipelago led Darwin to think that species had been taken and modified to different ends. This challenged so much of the thought of the fixity of species at the time, that species were independently and separately created in an original act of creation by a supernatural actor. That takes us back now to the question. So Darwin saw this variety, and it led him to the view that species have been taken and modified to different ends. So now we must go back to the question, why so much creative force, as he said, if such an expression may be used, on these small, barren, and rocky islands? What makes the Galapagos this, standard bearer of biodiversity? If it's not so much the quantity of its diversity, it's the uniqueness of its diversity, as we said at the outset, and how does that achieved? What makes Galapagos so conducive to making new species in such a small place? Bear in mind that the Galapagos is only a couple hundred miles across. Out here in California, we compare it to the distance between San Francisco and Yosemite. That's the basic difference across east to west across the Galapagos. The surface area total of the islands is less than our state of Delaware. Well, I call it the secret recipe of Galapagos, and I'll simplify it today to 4 main ingredients. I'll call it the 4 Ps. First, plates. Galapagos sits on top of the Nazca Plate and very close to its boundary with the Cocos Plate, these being the geological plates, continental plates that ride the surface of the Earth. The world is not what it's cracked up to be, we sometimes say. It's got a lot more cracks than you ever guessed, and the cracks are between these big plates. The pressure of molten magma from a hot spot breaking through the adjacent plates creates a cluster of volcanic islands over the hotspot. So there's this hotspot of molten magma coming up from the center of the Earth, making a cluster of islands. Other hotspots around the world, notably Hawaii, the Hawaiian archipelago, for example, the hotspot, as the plate moves along, the hotspot pierces it and creates a chain of islands rather than a cluster. But because Galapagos is close to the spreading zone between the Nazca and Cocos plates, we end up with a cluster. Position is the third P, isolated out in the ocean, on the equator. This hotspot is on the equator, subjects the Galapagos to a uniquely rich convergence of currents of wind and water that we'll look at in just a moment. And the persistence, the final P this morning, of the hotspot's activity over way more than 20 million years says that there have been islands in this area for a very long time. In fact, we believe there have been islands in the area for 17 to 20 million years without interruption in that location, and much longer than that, possibly with some periods where the volcanoes were still below the sea surface. The result is that we have, in this little corner of the world, an isolated, enriched by the wonderful volcanic soils as they break down, ancient cluster of volcanic islands. The pressure from the hotspot, you've all seen this image before, I'm sure, but there's a magma dome that gives rise to a magma chamber here, MC, and the pressure eventually bursts forth and causes active eruptions over a break in the oceanic plate. As the plate continues to move toward South America in its migration, as the plate is moving, it subsides, and that helped upthrust the Andes over the last 100 million years, where the friction creates another magma chamber, very different from the magma dome chamber over here. The magma chamber here gives rise to Cotopaxi, and the more, instead of the shield volcanoes, it gives rise to the stratovolcanoes that you think of, the more Mount Fuji style volcano. So the pressure is really important through the plate and gives rise to a cluster of islands as distinct from the Hawaiian Islands, for example, where the magma chamber, the magma pressure bursting forth from the hotspot creates a linear array of islands. Why is the cluster worth emphasizing? Because the distances, the mutual distances between pairs of islands in a cluster is much less than the distance across a linear array, if you take the averages. And that turns out to be important, as we'll see. The last thing to mention is this uniquely rich convergence of currents. The trade winds that blow along the equator, that come together at the equator from the north and from the south, they bring together the Panama and Humboldt currents into a large south equatorial current of water pushed by the trade winds from east to west. So you can see the south equatorial current there. It moves at a good pace, as fast as you can walk, sometimes faster. And a key role is also played by the equatorial countercurrent, which comes in the opposite direction, the so-called Cromwell current, which flows deep in the ocean opposite, from west to east, opposite the south equatorial current. The result is Galapagos is bathed in a tumult of currents. The south equatorial current is blocked by Galapagos, and as the water moves across, and that permits the Cromwell current to surface. So we have this blockage by the islands. The zoologist Martin Gorman looked at islands all over the world and found that the widest ocean gaps crossed by terrestrial animals are represented somewhat like this on this distance scale. So here's Galapagos at 1,000 kilometers off South America. And yeah, Galapagos has bats and land birds, no problem. They fly out that distance easily. Insects and spiders are hardy. They can float out on rafts or just fly out, some of them on their own. Land mollusks are hardy. They pull inside their shell and can survive drought and salt water and so on if they pull that little foot up inside their shell. Lizards can do okay too, because they're tough skin, because of those scales, but tortoises normally don't make it. Oh, but wait a minute. We do have tortoises in Galapagos. Rodents, little mammalian rodents don't make it. Oh, but they do in Galapagos. We don't have small carnivores in Galapagos. We don't have large mammals, and we don't have freshwater fish as a general rule. So maybe the Galapagos are somehow not quite as isolated as Gorman's sample of widest ocean gaps in the world. The tortoise and a rodent made it, actually the rice rat. Is something else involved? Well, yeah, it's the currents. Those currents I just talked about provide a conveyor belt of life from South America, from Central America, around with those currents out to the Galapagos Islands, because the currents are aimed right down the equator, which Galapagos sits upon. So this cluster with currents of wind and waves blowing in new potential colonists, the islands also of the cluster differ in age, size, and height. And rainfall and habitat vary by the height of each volcano because they intercept the moisture-laden clouds at a substantial altitude. That makes each volcano a unique petri dish. Ones that have a bigger, higher volcano will get more of that moisture, more clouds of precipitation and cloud interception rainfall. And lower islands that don't intercept the clouds will continue to be dry. The result is each volcano is a unique petri dish, you might think of it in a lab analogy, a unique mid-ocean incubator for life. Each one is going to have a different age because of the hotspot activity as the plate passes by. Each one has a different height. Each one has a different set of habitats and so on. This is a picture of Alcedo volcano on Isabella Island from satellite. I'm going to ask you to remember that isolation and time are key ingredients to the formation of species. Now, when you last read Darwin, you know that he said that isolation is a very important, that barriers and isolation are a matter of extreme importance for the formation, for the operation of his theory, for the descent with modification. And the modification also takes time. Darwin thought it was by insensibly fine gradations. We now know that sometimes evolution occurs much faster, but it does take isolation and time for new species to appear from old. Well, these petri dishes, my point being, are nearly ideal for the emergence of new species in Galapagos. Why? Let me illustrate with the current configuration of the islands, but any old cluster will do, including those actual old clusters, back to 17 and 20 million years ago. Any old cluster will work. There's our hotspot, or approximately where we think it is in the Western archipelago today. So the islands in the West are younger. The oldest islands are in the east. The youngest islands are in the west. The plate is moving. The Nazca plate is moving from left to right in this picture. Now, I use this diagram with some hesitation because the configuration of the islands is constantly changing. If we roll back 20 million years, they wouldn't look at all like this. So just think of this as the last frame of the movie of the islands changing through time as the plate moves over the hot spot, and that will help prevent this problem I'm worried about. So let's start with colonization. Some animal rides in, blows in, swims in, flies in, however it gets there, and it builds up a population, which then colonizes in a secondary colonization other islands, which then we get the sequential colonization of isolated islands. But since each one is a unique petri dish, you're going to have different conditions. You'll have different founders going out to those different islands. And the result is, with different founders and different ecological conditions on each island, you're going to get differentiation in time. You're going to get the kind of differentiation that spells species differences after enough differences accumulate. But now it's even better because in a cluster where the islands are somewhat close together, because of the way the hotspot worked under the two plates, you can have back colonization, creating even more differentiation because a species from the left can go back to the right. And they did that, and we know they did that in some cases. I'm going to give you an example in just a moment. So the result is that you've got an ideal world here in the little world in the middle of the Pacific for the emergence of new species. Let's take the leaf-toed gecko, which exists in 9 species in the Galapagos today. And from the work of Torres Carvajal, you can see that there was an initial colonization of San Cristobal, a secondary colonization of Española, then to Floreana, and finally to Santa Cruz and Alta Isabela, and then a back colonization, shown there by number 4, to Rábida and Pinzón Islands. So they're going out, and then they're coming back from Pinzón and Rábida, the opposite direction. And what you can see then is how this process and the sequential colonizations out and back can give rise to the diversity of species of the leaf-toed gecko. So Galapagos is famous for these branching trees of endemics, right? You've all heard of them, the divergence of species from one or a few colonizations. So within the last million years, the most famous case is probably the finches. That from one ancestor, we have 18 species of recognized finches today. Now, these are the incomplete species that we recognize. I'm not gonna stake too much of a claim here on whether they're genetically distinct species as inferred from an inbreeding crossbreeding test. I'm not gonna. We'll just leave it that 18 morphological species, recognizable species from one ancestor. Let's move to land snails. Land snails, in the last 2.8 million years from their colonization, these are the little guys that are the size of your fingernails, just little land snails, most of them. There are more than 80 species today descended from a common ancestor 2.8 million years ago. That's a lot of species. If the finches are the classic, the land snails set the record or close to it. All right. Tortoises are also an example, right? You know about the difference between saddleback and dome tortoises. And the genetics points to the radiation of the tortoises in the last 2 million years, so that there are 15 morphs around the archipelago where the shells are of different shape as just one measure of the biodiversity of the tortoises. Recent work in 2024 suggests that there are really 13 species there. There was a challenge from the uh, uh, Caribbean tortoises. People were saying, well, it looks like the Galapagos tortoises are really subspecies. But more recent work here in 2024 confirms that we're looking at least 13 species in the Galapagos. So that's impressive, especially impressive for an organism that has 60-some years of generation in its generation time. Sadly, 3 of them are extinct, but there's hope in bringing back the pinta from some hybrids found on the north of Isabella. Earlier, I mentioned the giant daisies of the genus Scalesia. These are among my favorite examples of this kind of radiation. Here they are, those trees again. They too have radiated in Galapagos. There are 15 endemic species of Scalesias, not all of them trees, from one Asteraceae ancestor. As the botanist Eliasson summarized, a great diversity is shown in the shape of leaves. It's like as if you went to the grocery store and the grocery store of Scalesia leaves and could find things as different as romaine lettuce and, shall we say, arugula, although they're not the same plant. The leaves are that different. So here you might have your romaine up here, and here you might have your arugula down here. You can see that the diversity of these related leaves is just tremendous. And all of them are from one common ancestral colonization of the islands. In other words, this process of descent with modification from a common ancestor reached one of its highlights, one of its high points in the radiation of the genus Scalesia in Galapagos, including trees, and including the shape of the leaves and the height of the plant. So we have both shrubs and we have, in extreme cases, trees. We have 4 species of trees in Galapagos. So what are the lessons from these magnificent radiations? What lessons do we draw about the biodiversity of Galapagos? Well, first of all, there are many. Finches, land snails, tortoises, scalesias that I've shown you, plus iguanas that we've hardly mentioned, lava lizards, mockingbirds, even moths show this pattern of radiation from a common ancestral form in relatively quickly recent periods of time, geologically speaking. These examples involve mobile organisms. They're all mobile at a range of different speeds, land snails being the slowest, and interestingly, they have the most species. So the rate at which you move around islands may inhibit the rate at which you form new species, the slowest one having the most species. And as you speed things up, as your mobility increases, you may get fewer and fewer species because that separation, that isolation that you require, according to the theory, the isolation will be reduced. They're mobile except for the scalesias. The scalesias, of course, just produce little seeds, but they may well have co-evolved with dispersal agents, the tree finches, who provided their mobility. So an exception that isn't really an exception, it's the exception that tests the rule and confirms the rule, is that they too are mobile, but they're not mobile on their own. They're mobile in the mouths of the birds that consume them. So this brings me to our final enigma this morning. In this little world that is nearly ideal for species formation, some species arrive, establish, that means they survive and reproduce, and do not change or change very little. Now, there are, of course, some straightforward, easy cases. Recent arrivals, because the evolution of differences, as we've said, takes isolation and time. If they haven't been there very long, even in this wonderfully isolated collection, this cluster of isolated islands, some colonists will be too new. The paint-billed crake is probably a good example of that. The paint-billed crake is a recent arrival, and it hasn't differentiated much. But there are more challenging examples, such as the Galapagos flamingo and the Galapagos rail, to which we now turn. Isn't that a beautiful bird? Consider the Galapagos flamingo. Belongs to the genus Phenacopterus, which thrives basically almost around the world in locations of water and sun. So here we have the distribution of Phenacopterus. Here we have Phenacopterus ruber in the Caribbean, and here we have the same Phenacopterus ruber in Galapagos. Here we have Phenacopterus chilensis, and here we have Phenacopterus roseus in the Eastern Hemisphere. There are there's another genus of flamingos, but I'm going to focus on the Phenacopterus today. Now, we call this group over here in the Galapagos Islands of Phenacopterus ruber, we call it the Galapagos population. It's not considered a subspecies, let alone a separate species from the American or the Caribbean flamingo. American and Caribbean are sometimes used interchangeably, but you know, this is the flamingo that you see in Florida, or that you see in the West Indies, or that you see in the Florida Keys, and so on. What's interesting is that the Galapagos population interbreeds with the American Caribbean flamingo in captivity. So it lacks that intrinsic isolation barrier that designates distinct species, at least in one kind of test. So the genetic differences, as studied by geneticists, indicate an isolation of the American flamingo population in Galapagos from that in the Caribbean for 70,000 years minimally, and maybe as much as 350,000 years. Well, that means they are separated by more than 5,000 generations. That's a lot of time, and that can result in impressive evolutionary differences. Well, it turns out there are some differences. The tarsus, which is a big part of the ankle, but it looks like it's part of the leg in a flamingo because of the way their knees are hidden up under their plumage a lot of the time. The tarsus length and the eggs of the Galapagos flamingo are smaller volume egg, 83% of the average Caribbean egg's volume in the Galapagos egg. Now, I think that's an interesting observation. That's the kind of thing that will add up to make a subspecies or even a different species, possibly sometime. But why are they not considered a different species? Why are there not more differences? And why is there not a reproductive barrier between them? This gives rise to an interesting hypothesis. I can't test all aspects of this today, but I put out there this hypothesis that the American flamingo arrived ready for Galapagos, with a remarkable set of pre-existing features that enable it to survive under harsh conditions in the archipelago. It's not all that surprising if you stop to think about the Caribbean population of flamingos also ranges across many islands. And so the flamingos have encountered all kinds of things in their Caribbean habitat. And when some came to Galapagos, it's not too surprising that they came sort of ready for Galapagos in a lot of ways. Let me mention I hesitate to use the word pre-adaptation because evolution does not have an anticipatory dimension. Evolution is not anticipating what they're going to need in Galapagos, but they came ready with this stuff from the Caribbean. They have a thermoregulatory capacity. You all know about that. A number of special mechanisms, including standing on one leg, helps keep flamingos cool. And it's been shown that in Galapagos, the Galapagos flamingos stand more often in cold water on their leg than they do on land, on one leg than they do on land or in warm water. Their diet breadth, they have a diverse diet. Well, we all think of them as eating brine shrimp. They eat brine shrimp, but they eat other insects. They eat other small prey in the water. And so diet switching, prey switching, allows them to feed over a good range of water conditions. The most important probably is this behavioral resilience. The Galapagos flamingos are buffered from climate change by their proclivity for moving. They take off and fly. Have you seen a flamingo fly? They have a most beautiful wingspan. You can see the black fringes when they fly, a beautiful wingspan. And they fly in Galapagos between lagoons when conditions change. When El Nino hits, they fly to islands and lagoons less affected by El Nino. Their proclivity for moving buffers them from some aspects of El Nino and from climate change. Interestingly, they also show reproductive resilience via hormones. They synchronize their breeding in small groups, allowing local population rebounds. They don't come into fertile periods asynchronously, each female or what have you. They have convergent, synchronized breeding mediated by hormones. So all of these things help the flamingo, and especially the mobility, because isolation is a requirement again for separate species formation. Well, let's turn to the last and perhaps most challenging of all examples, the Galapagos rail, Lateralis spilinota. It's also called Darwin's rail. It's a beautiful bird, very difficult to see in the wild because they're timid and because they hide in dense vegetation. The Latin name means roughly spots along the side at the back, which you can see it deserves. It's called El Pachay in Spanish, and it's quite, there's a lot of fond talk about the El Pachay in Galapagos. It's such an interesting and unusual bird, sparrow-sized, but with huge feet, as befits its life as a marsh dweller. It's thought that early in the history of Galapagos, before much human habitation, they also inhabited the mangrove marshy areas, but now they inhabit the marshier areas up near the in the moist zones at the top of tall islands in Galapagos. Well, it turns out that if you look around the world, lots of island rails are flightless. One could say rails come prepared for flightlessness. Here's the inaccessible island rail, which is a classic, incapable of flight. They spend much of their time on the ground already, even in Galapagos, to nest and forage. The adults have small rounded wings and small flight muscles, so it doesn't take much for them to stop using those, use it or lose it to an extent. After hatching, they feed themselves in days, and their feathers are delayed for weeks, so there's a period in which they depend on their feet and on foraging on the ground. Anyway, and the sternum does not ossify until weeks after hatching. All this sets them up for repeated neoteny, that is to say, the evolutionary retention of juvenile features. A mutation can give rise to a deletion or an impeded development, and they can stay with a non-ossified sternum. They can stay without developed feathers, and they may save energy in that case, or have other advantages. They may need less food, so on and so on. So a lot of rails evolve flightlessness in the islands. The result is piddly wings, as we say. Here's the wing of the Galapagos rail, and you can tell it's small. There is a chick hiding under the female here, and you can see the wing of that female. You can see why many observers conclude that El Pachay is non-volant. That is to say that the Galapagos rail does not fly anymore, that it came, and just like so many other rails, evolution favored the changes of sternum and wing muscles and so on, in the interest possibly of saving energy, that gave it these tiny little wings. Well, there's a set of insightful results from a new whole genome analysis in a wide sample of Galapagos, undertaken by Chavez and Chavez and their colleagues. They argue that a volant rail blew into Galapagos, fully capable of flight about 1.2 million years ago, and spread widely across the islands, used those little piddly wings and flew across all the islands and colonized. They say further that the Isabella population was the first to differentiate. Well, actually, probably the Pinta Island population was the very first to differentiate. Pinta's up in the north where Lonesome George came from, an island way to the north. But of the central islands, Isabella was the first to differentiate, resulting from sea level rise and a landmass separation, a vicariance event, we call it, that occurred at that time. That has set things up so that there's a bit of a difference with Isabella and a bit of a difference in the genome of the Pinta tortoise, but there's a continuing lack of genetic diversity among populations of Santiago and Santa Cruz Islands, islands more central to the archipelago, suggesting that they lack effective isolation. Was there an effective land bridge between them until recently? In other words, is there a lack of genetic diversity because they could walk out from one island to another and thus lack that isolation, thus have what we call gene flow between the islands, lacking that isolation because they had a bridge? Or are rails better flyers than widely assumed? You know, the black rail of North America was assumed also to be largely, well, at least hesitant to fly, and even a irregular flyer, not flying great distances, until the US of A put up some listening devices along the border with Mexico in telephone poles and power lines, and listened for human migration. What they picked up more than anything else was black rail migration, the chattering of rails. Now, rails are normally very quiet, but they chatter, they make some noise as they fly when they're migrating in the darkness. Now, they also tend to migrate during the new moon, so they're very hard to see. Could it be that in Galapagos, rails are flying more than widely assumed? Could they be flying distances greater than what we observe? We see them flying 30, 40, 50 meters. So we come to these conclusions on the Galapagos rail. Conclude our researchers, Chavez et al., it's possible the Galapagos rail individuals were fully volant for much of their early evolutionary history, potentially facilitating their movement across neighboring islands, as well as the relatively long-distance colonization of Pinta. That would explain how they got up there to Pinta, and that would explain why the Santa Cruz and Santiago variants are so similar. Well, it could be that they continue to fly. To me, the rail and flamingo cases seem quite parallel and highlight the importance of mobility. In other words, in this wonderful place, Galapagos, that's so good at creating diversity, that the separation, the isolation of islands can be undone by the mobility of organisms. Without effective isolation for long periods, even Galapagos cannot produce much biodiversity. I thank you for your attention this morning, and I'd be delighted to take your questions. I hope you've enjoyed our little look, not so much at the amount of biodiversity in Galapagos, but at its unique diversity and some of the ways in which that unique diversity was generated by the geomorphology of the Galapagos Islands. I'm happy to take any questions. Camila, will you help me with questions? Maybe be a moderator for me and relay the questions?
Yes,
We'll
sure.
start. I-
So the questions are already open. We're waiting on
Okay,
questions. Yes.
I will stop sharing my screen. How did we
So,
do, everyone? Was that fairly clear?
mhm. I really liked your presentation, Bill,
Oh,
personally.
thank you.
So we do have a first question from Sally Thorson. Don't the finches, mockingbirds also fly between islands?
Oh, such a good question. Such a very good question. Of course they do. The mockingbirds, let's take the mockingbird case first. The mockingbirds tend to be very territorial. The mockingbirds form territorial groups. And it's been surmised that the territoriality sort of swamps out the tendency to migrate. Now, they obviously did differentiate by migration, by flight, when they first colonized the Galapagos. But the surmise is that for a variety of reasons, but one of which is the territoriality of their defense of feeding areas and mates, that they don't fly, they don't depart on big flights, the better to defend territory, because territorial attacks and territorial displays are common in mockingbirds. I'm not always fully convinced of this argument, but this is the argument that is commonly given for that fact. Now, it turns out that the finches, of course, fly among various islands. They're blown, of course, and blown between islands as well, or at least they get some assistance from the strong winds. Remember, those trade winds can be very strong in Galapagos. So we know that little birds tend to get a boost from the atmospheric conditions, but indeed they do use their wings. We know that the tree finches are more volant. They fly longer distances anyway than the ground finches and so on. So there's some variation among the finches. And this no doubt contributes to the diversification of the finches, the ground finches having a diverse set of ground finches. Tree finches are also diverse, and but they're more volant. I'm not sure we fully understand why. It has a lot to do with food supply in the case of the finches. Their specialization is not so much by island as it is by food source during times of limited food. So what I would say is that the unique qualification of the finch's beak, that wonderful mechanical leveraging device that is the finch's beak, and its flexibility, its genetically modifiable structure has allowed them to become adapted not so much to place as to food item, wherever they find suitable food items. So the result is that migration does not impede the specialization, the food-based specialization. That's the best I could do in answering the question. There are probably better answers out there.
Thank you, Bill. So we have a next one from Dennis Geist. He says, I assume that the crake was not human introduced. Is there any constraint on when it colonized?
We know quite a bit about the introduction of the crake. We don't know exactly how it came. No one can remember exactly, but it's been around 40 years, I believe, even more than that. So it's been around a while. No one knows whether it was humanly introduced or whether it found its own way out. Being in the family of rails, it's a hesitant flyer like all the other rails. Dillon Ripley, the former head of the Smithsonian, was a real rail expert. And he said, you know what? Before you jump to conclusions about rails flying or not flying, you should realize that they're all hesitant, every one of them, because ground provides better cover. Because in the air, you're subject to all those wonderful acrobatic predators that are the hawks in Galapagos or that are the raptors in other places. These little birds are really susceptible. And Ripley said, they evolved a hesitation to flight. That's a last resort very often. Now, he says when they do fly, when they do take off, they fold their legs up under and they fly very well in the vast majority of cases. This is not true for the inaccessible island rail and other rails that really have such piddly wings that they can't even generate lift. They're adorable in their piddly wings and all that, but that's a very specialized adaptation in the absence of many predators. Galapagos is interesting because it has the hawk, and it's because it has the hawk, and we know the hawk feeds on the rails. We know that the rails seek. They hide out in the vegetation of the highland zones rather than expose themselves to predation. And so we imagine that it's their general hesitancy again in the face of a threat of predation.
Great. Thank you so much. So the next one is from Micaela Benavides. Is there any sound diversity based on the different islands?
Any what diversity?
A sound diversity.
Sound diversity. You mean different sounds?
Yeah, I believe like she
Uh-huh.
talks about the mockingbirds and the species.
Sound. I want to make sure I have the right
Yeah.
word. Uh-huh. I'm sure there's differences in sound because of the size of the islands. There's some islands where you can hear the surf from everywhere. And there are other islands where you don't hear the surf except right near the, right near the coastline, at the shoreline zonation. There must be enormous differences also depending on the flora and fauna. That is to say, how many birds are there making territorial defense sounds and all the rest of it. It's not probably as sonically diverse as other environments we can imagine. Populations tend to be small in Galapagos, of course, and so it's not a noisy place, but I'm sure there could be. Yeah, I think sound
Sorry,
is
Bill,
should be looked at.
so I think she means vocalizations, like from the birds.
Oh, vocalizations. Okay, and so the question is, repeat the question then.
So it would be, sorry. Is there any vocalization diversity based on the islands, like on different islands from the birds? Like,
Uh-huh. That's a question that requires someone with a lot more ornithological expertise than me. I bet you they're dialects, but that's just a bet. I knew Bob Bowman in the day, and he was very big on the study of Finch songs and Finch dialects, and I'm pretty sure he was talking about subtle inter-island differences, but I'm not the right person to ask for where that leads and if how strong it is. I'm sorry. Try,
Mhm.
but that's the best I can do. Read the work of Bob Bowman, I would say, in those sense.
Thank you. So the next one, were mockingbirds very different to in the mainland that they had to adapt in Galapagos? Were they not prepared to live in Galapagos like the flamingo or the
Oh,
rail, and
I
why?
love this question. I love this question. There's been this wonderful debate about Darwin and Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace, co-discoverer of the principle of natural selection. And I think it hinges on Darwin's finding the mockingbirds first and foremost. Darwin did not get to Espanola Island. Espanola Island has the one mockingbird that's the most distinctive, at least to my judgment, to my eye. It has a bigger beak. It has several characteristics that stand out from the others, but the beak is quite noteworthy, and it's one of the flattest islands, one of the driest islands. And when I see those mockingbirds on Espanola digging in the sand, I realize that digging in the sand is an important way they get moisture from little pockets of moisture of fresh water and diluted salt water in the sand. So what's interesting to me is that it's possible that some of the variation in the Galapagos mockingbirds derives from natural selection. But try as he might, think about it as much as he might have, Darwin could not come up with a compelling natural selection explanation for the differences in most of the mockingbirds found on the islands that he went to. So this is interesting because although mockingbirds led Darwin to the view that species have changed in Galapagos and led him to the view that natural selection is the key agent of that change, the mockingbirds were not an example that he could explain with his own theory. Meanwhile, Alfred Russel Wallace over in the Indonesian archipelago, a bit after Darwin, but independently, studies tiger beetles. And lo and behold, all the differences in tiger beetles encountered by Alfred Russel Wallace could be explained by natural selection. So when he thought of, during the malarial fit and reading Malthus and the rest of it, the story is very parallel to Darwin's. When he thought of natural selection, he said, well, look at that. Voila, eureka, I found it. That explains everything there is about the tiger beetles. So in complete contrast, Darwin with the mockingbirds, the example that starts that he can't really explain with the mechanism he comes up with, means that Darwin has to be more eclectic. He has to have other things. So he repeatedly says natural selection is the main but not exclusive means, because if it were exclusive, the mockingbirds would be enigmatic to him. So there's other things involved. Whereas Wallace says, oh, it's all the result of natural selection. And Wallace went on to become an ardent selectionist, thinking that everything was the result of natural selection, which eventually brought him to the view that the ridiculous view that the human brain did not evolve by natural selection because it has powers that couldn't have been exercised and resulted in reproductive success. If everything has to be just a simple product of natural selection, Wallace was in a dead-end trap. Darwin tried so hard to convince him. He said, were you to have too completely murdered your own and my child, saying you're overdoing natural selection? There's more than that. So I think it's really fascinating that the Galapagos mockingbird is not a good example of coming to Galapagos with a lot of with and evolving adaptations. It's more like the flamingo. They came with a lot of the skills necessary to survive in Galapagos, and the differences we see are more readily ascribed to drift, to the selective retention of chance variation, as happens in the course of evolutionary processes.
Thanks,
I
Bill.
love that question. Very good question.
Yes. So from Maria Jose Barragan, where would you see the highest priority to look at from the research perspective to fill the knowledge gaps within the next years? Some hints?
That's a wonderful question. It's a very deep and thoughtful question. My mind just starts rattling off the little things I'd like to know. I'd like to know the Galapagos martin is believed to be a separate species. What evidence do we have for that? How has it changed? It's a relatively recent arrival. The back to the flamingo, I'd like to know much more about the flamingos in Galapagos. I'd like to know more about the rails. Do the rails fly in Galapagos? Do we have any eyewitness accounts? It's hard on a new moon to see rails flying, but it's almost an untestable hypothesis. But the way they reappeared in Pinta after they were extinct, it's many kilometers from the nearest island out to Pinta. It didn't float out there, I don't suppose. I don't think it was carried by a ship. So I wonder. I just wonder, and I think that's a good. So my mind proliferates with all the specifics. There are a lot of big questions. Big questions really have to do with sustainability, and can humans learn to live with this wonderful biodiversity? Can we really make a sustainable go of it? And if we can, Galapagos could be this magnificent example for the world of making a go of it. So, I would say that there are a bunch of little questions that just pop into my mind. But the really important questions are those having to do with, can we work out a way for the coexistence of this fragile biodiversity in small populations with very specialized properties and adaptations, and our almost limitless push and demand for more and more area, for more visitors, for more activity. We've got to find a way to make Galapagos sustainable, or we risk losing all the things we've talked about this morning. And I think that's the really big question. Maria Jose, I love the way you ask the big questions, and they always bring me to the big answers, they bring me to the big challenges. I'm not sure they have brought me to any big answers yet.
Mhm. So the next one from Sofia Ayala, could you elaborate about how the currents were one of the reasons as to why species such as turtles were able to reach Galapagos?
Yes. So with the confluence of the trade winds, due to the Coriolis forces, the trade winds come together. They have a directionality to them. From the north, they move toward the west, and from the south, they move toward the west. So they come together at the equator, and they generate this very strong wind. Well, if you remember that waves are the memory of the wind, I love that expression, waves being the memory of the wind, you're going to have strong currents and pretty good waves as those trade winds blow down the equator. So what we surmise from the work of Gorman that I referred to, zoologist who did the studies of, where do you find vertebrates on different islands? Where do you find, what life do you find on islands around the world? We can conclude that something has facilitated the arrival of at least the tortoises and rodents in Galapagos, because you shouldn't find them there. They're outside the normal reach that you expect on islands. So that points to the currents. How do the currents do that? In the case of tortoises, we know tortoises float. Their lungs are high up in their carapace. They have a pretty large fat deposition. Fat and oils, as you know, float on water. So the tortoises, although they're heavy, they float. And, it's been shown for years that they float. Some people, some expeditions have thrown tortoises in the water to see, and sometimes people find them. Sometimes they're launched by El Nino storms when deluges of rain fall in Galapagos. We know tortoises float. It's not at all surprising and not at all beyond our imagination that a tortoise could be pushed out to Galapagos. Now, not long ago, I looked up all the drift studies for the South Equatorial Current. That is to say, if you take a log and release it on the coast of Ecuador, how long does it take to reach as far out from the mainland as Galapagos? And I concluded at that time, now I'm not saying this was the best study or the most methodologically accurate, but I concluded it was about 8 days when the currents were going strong. And, that really speeds things up because it's a lot more than that. If you're just drifting along, you could drift in a lot of different directions and never make it to Galapagos. To drift out to Galapagos, to be pushed out to Galapagos on this conveyor of the South Equatorial Current in 8 days, that helps explain why we find mollusks, lizards, snails, so many forms of life in Galapagos that you might otherwise perish. So I think the currents are really important. I think more drift studies could be done. We all talk about the drifting rafts of vegetation. It would be fun to document a few arriving someday after an El Nino deluge releases lots of rafts out into the sea. It'd be fun to watch some make it all the way to Galapagos. I think that would be a wonderful project, and we'd learn a lot from it, I think.
So this one probably actually adds up to the last question. Could
Okay.
hurricanes could hurricanes have played a role in bringing birds such as flamingos and rails to the Galapagos Islands? She says, I mean rare hurricanes that end in the Pacific, like the one that hits El Salvador some 20 or some more years ago.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by hurricanes. And I'm fascinated by the importance that they're playing now in Mexico and Central America, and even the southwestern United States has some effects of those storms. Um, a lot of that, it's not impossible, but a lot of the hurricanes we're seeing today have an added force and an added velocity coming from climate change, coming from the warming of the atmosphere, from the greenhouse effect. There's no, I'm not a climatologist, but climatologists do not doubt that hurricanes and tornadoes, extreme storms of many kinds, are gathering energy and gathering force. So if hurricanes did play a role, it was episodic. It was rare, as you point out in the question. It would have been quite rare, but certainly not impossible. Now, the question is, would a hurricane during El Nino conditions, winds normally die way down. But would a hurricane in non-El Nino conditions, would a hurricane have a chance against the trade winds? My suspicion has always been that the trade winds preclude the operation of a storm of the kind like a tornado or a hurricane. But, I could be really wrong about that. The trade winds are so strong, you can feel it, and they're very important to the arrival of life to Galapagos. I'm fully convinced of that. But I wonder if hurricanes and tornadoes, if real tropical storms of those kinds have played much of a role because of the force of the trade. Galapagos sitting right astride the equator means that it's going to get the full brunt of the trade winds unless something stops those trade winds, like the reversal of the Walker cell when you get an El Nino event. That stops the trade winds. They go sort of the other direction, and that will do the job. But when they're going, yeah, I just don't know. Maybe it does happen. Maybe you do get hurricanes or other storms during El Nino events. I wonder. I don't know. I love your questions, everybody. I thank you for your your attention today. I hope it's been useful on this day of World Biodiversity to give you a little perspective on how Galapagos is so good at making new species and sometimes isn't. I just find that a fascinating question, and I love to go there and ask myself, is this one of those that does it, or is this one that doesn't? And that's a fun question to ask.
Thank you, Bill. So we will do one last question, and
Okay.
we do have a few other pending questions. I'm not sure about your timing. Do you
I'm
want
fine, but I don't want people to feel they have to stay on. I'm fine.
Okay.
I can go
So
till 10:30. Mhm.
perfect. So we will do just two more questions, and then for the rest of the people, Bill is also sharing his email. So if you have any further questions, you can also expand through there. So for the next one, it says, you hesitated to say that the finches were reproductively isolated. How much genetic work has been done on that group?
Oh boy, there's this. We used to call it the $64,000 question. It's not enough anymore. It's a $64 million question. That's a wonderful, wonderful question. What we're seeing is that, I mean, there are scholars, serious scholars. Zink is one scholar who comes to mind, Zink, I believe it's spelled, who says basically there's one groundfinch species with lots of variation and one treefinch species with lots of variation, and there are, warbler finch. There's one warbler finch with lots of variation. There are people who say that the finches so widely interbreed that you can't conclude that they're even in the process of species formation. I side with the Grants, with Peter and Rosemary Grant. Their work is so compelling. They have a wonderful book, How and Why Species Multiply, that spells out pretty carefully that the Galapagos finches are species before speciation is completed, that it takes a long time to get to reproductive isolation through the intergenerational genetic changes that we experience as organisms live it out in Galapagos. And I'm fully persuaded by their argument that the multiplicity of species of finches in Galapagos, they're imperfect species. They're not, the job is not finished. They don't have reliable, 100% efficient reproductive barriers. Now, maybe I'm old-fashioned, and maybe someone like Zink is more with it. I'm old-fashioned in insisting on the old sort of gold standard that reproductive isolation is the best measure of species differences among living organisms. And there's so many different species concepts. There are more than 20 species concepts used in evolutionary thinking today. And I'm sort of old school and sticking with the biological species concept. It goes back to Darwin. Darwin had some questions about it, but he used it quite regularly in his own thinking, even with his pigeons. The fact that the pigeons could all interbreed, he said, this shows you they're all of one species. Darwin was a pigeon breeder and fancier, as you know. Anyway, so I think that the grants are on the right track. I think they recognize that morphological species are on their way to becoming separate species, driven by selection pressures originating in food supply, largely, but other factors as well. And that, if we don't make a mess of things, they may go on to evolve into completely reproductively isolated species. So I think that's what I can contribute on that idea. I mean, I think the finches do readily hybridize. Almost, well, many of them do. I don't know the full list of pairings that have been observed, but many, many finches hybridize. I don't think across the full range, but within the groups, within the ground finches, within the tree finches, within the warbler finches, cactus finches, I bet there is a lot of hybridization.
Awesome. So the last question is, which of the pre-adaptations do you think is most influential with respect to species that don't radiate much, or does it vary between species in terms of the influence of the four factors?
Oh, there's a wonderful question. That's a winner right there. That's somebody's thinking like I like to think. That's just exactly the kind of question I like to ask. And I don't have an answer, but the more examples I look at, I stuck my neck out on the rails and I said, they might still be flying out there. I'm going to get shot down for that one. My flight is going to be over on that one because somebody's going to just show that they can't fly. They really cannot fly across from one island to another. Even close islands, they just can't fly. But so far, flamingos and the possibility of the rails persuade me that mobility flight needs to be looked at carefully. And mobility in general, the ability to move and to fly back and forth, anything that contributes to gene flow, especially if it works in both directions, can go either direction, will tend to generate more mixing. Now, it's not just any old flight. It's got to be a pretty decent flyer, which is why the piddly wings of the rail give me some pause because you're out there fluttering around in the trade winds. Flamingos are a little more understandable to me because they have a pretty hefty wing and they're capable of pretty long distance flight. I mean, I'm sure that's how they got to Galapagos in the first place, flying out across Mexico and out to Galapagos, or across Central America and out to Galapagos. So, the final word is an end, but I suspect that mobility is very important. I think there are many qualifying characteristics for arriving in Galapagos and being successful. And I bet food supply flexibility is another one, the ability to prey switch, to switch over to a different insect or to switch to a different fish or something like that is probably very important. But so far I'm taken with the idea that mobility is one of the things that prevents many species from radiating in Galapagos.
Awesome, Bill. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge. It has been a very instructive webinar.
Well,
So,
thank you.
yeah,
It's not so much knowledge as it is hypothesis generation, right? That's
yes,
It's not like
definitely.
I'm sitting here telling you the truth. I'm telling you some good ideas. I hope they're good ideas that ought to be tested and ought to be thrown out when they deserve to be thrown out. I'm not stuck on any of these ideas, but I think it's really fun in Galapagos to try out new ideas. And I think that's how science really advances.
Okay. Thank you so much. So this meeting has been recorded. We will post it on social media, so it will be available
So I'll be in
probably
trouble
first thing
forever.
next week. You'll be in trouble for everything. No, these are great hypotheses for
Uh,
sure. That will make everybody research about the rails.
Thanks again to everybody at the Darwin Station, especially Camila, to you and to Daniela, and basically everyone there for making this possible. I really enjoy it. And I learn a lot when I put these thoughts together, because sometimes the thoughts just occur to you and you string them out and they never come together. And this kind of an opportunity gives you a chance to pull your thoughts together. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so we'll see you again soon for sure.
See you
Thank you so
soon.
much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.